When CDN launched 3 years ago, we declared that we are unapologetically pro-democracy. And a big part of our mission boy, what a great audience. A big part of our mission is to provide information and insights to promote what we believe is most essential to democracy, a well-informed electorate. This program and others we hope to hold in the future are part of that mission. Our guest tonight is America's foremost travel writer, Rick Steves, but tonight he's not going to talk about how to find a great cafe in Paris or offer tips on how to travel to Europe with a carry-on bag. Tonight, Rick will show his public TV special program, The Story of Fascism in Europe, and we'll talk about the lessons we should learn from that history. After we show the video, Rick will be joined on stage by Cascadia Daily News executive editor Ron Judd, who will chat with Rick about the video and some of the uncomfortable parallels we see today. We'll also have time for some of your questions, and here's how to ask a question. We're using an interactive Q&A process with a service called Slido. You can find step-by-step instructions on how to submit the question on the cards you got at the door. To ask a question, simply grab your phone, scan the QR code on the card, or if you're QR code challenged like I am, just go to slido.com and enter the participant code, which is CDN, as in Cascadia Daily News. And you'll see a Q&A tab, and under that tab, submit your question. And your question will appear under review until our question master, CDN digital editor J.F. Flannery, approves it. We'll get to as many questions as we can. On the other side of the card, you'll find information on how to subscribe to Cascadia Daily News. A healthy democracy depends on healthy local news organizations. So if you want to support healthy local news organizations, the best thing you can do is to subscribe to one. Now, many of us know Rick Steves as an indispensable source for information on how to get the most out of our travels to Europe, whether finding that perfect local cafe or small hotel or that special off-the-beaten-path attraction. But travel has strongly shaped Rick's worldview. It led him to write Travel as a Political Act, in which he advises travelers to get out of their comfort zone, meet people, come back with sometimes life-changing insights they can share with others. And a few years ago, as he traveled in Europe, he saw some uneasy parallels between the political reality in the United States and the climate in 1930s Europe that gave rise to Hitler and Mussolini. The result was a 2018 public television special called The History of Fascism in Europe, which we'll see and discuss tonight. Now, please join me in welcoming Rick Steves.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You know, it's very exciting as a tour guide and a travel teacher and a fellow citizen to be able to gather everybody together today and invest a couple of hours in understanding a concept that is getting thrown around in our society so much lately that we got to pause and go, just what is fascism? You know, I should know what fascism is. I wrote a TV show about it, but I have a tough time defining it. And there's all sorts of brilliant people in editorials and universities and so on trying to describe what fascism is. It's really tough to get a tight, total, clear definition. But I really believe when you see fascism, you recognize it. And I have such a strong sense, not only of what fascism is, but what its impact can be, just from my travels and my teaching. I often wonder what makes a good travel writer. and what makes a good commentator on what's going on in the world. And to me, there's this sort of thing and there's this sort of thing. This is traveling, so you're not ethnocentric. You can see things in different mindsets. You can see things as a Sri Lankan parent. You could see things as an Orthodox Jew. You could try to see things as a devout Muslim. You could see things as somebody in Trump's base, and you could see some things as a typical person from Bellingham, okay? There's all these different mindsets that are shaped by our life experiences and our worldviews. And what I'm so excited about now is to try to learn from, that's this dimension of travel that helps, to be able to understand that we are not the norm. You know, and that's a hard thing for a lot of Americans because we're so proud of who we are, to think that we're not exceptional. You know, the only thing exceptional about us is our ability to think that we are, in God's eyes, exceptional. Because there's 96% out there that are just as exceptional, you see. So that's the thing you learn when you travel. And if that bothers you, I bet you have not traveled very much, you see. Now, that's this way. And then this way is history. All right, and I have a history degree. I then got a business degree for something practical. And when I look back on it now, I think my history degree was every bit as practical as my business degree. With history, you can see back in time, you can see what lessons history is teaching us, and you can realize what sort of trajectory we may or may not be on. And that, coupled with this, helps me a lot in my work. Germany learned from some very hard lessons from history. And what astounds me is how these lessons are screaming to us, democracies 100 years later, and we're just in denial about what happened. Oh, it couldn't happen here. What do you think Germans thought when they met this inspirational, bombastic wannabe autocrat in the 1920s? You know, it couldn't happen here. Well, it could happen here. The takeaway today is I hope we recognize fascism when we see it. And the takeaway is not Trump is bad. The takeaway is going to be, what is fascism? And do I like fascism? And then if somebody is a fascist, do I want to support him? You know, you very well may come away from this hour and think fascism is good. The trains will run on time. You know, it's good for short-term prosperity. It's good if you own a corporation. Fascism. Hitler sold it. Fascists today, all over Western democracy worlds, are selling fascism. Half of our society is buying it. And they are saying, what do I want? Short-term economic success? Do I want a big wall? Or do I want something that is civil liberties and democracy? We have to make a choice. I originated this show sort of accidentally. I'm very frugal in my TV production, and we had some very, very good bits of Nazi sightseeing that didn't make it in the show about Bavaria, or didn't make it in the show about Berlin, or didn't make the show about Amsterdam, and it was just laying there, growing old on the editing room floor. And I got my team together, can't we just lace these together and do a quick little cheap show? And they said, well, I don't know, but let's look at it and study it. So we were going to make this little half-hour collection of Hitler's Eagle's Nest and this, you know, leftover building from the Luftwaffe or whatever. And then we just couldn't do a halfway job. The more we got into it, the more it became a one-hour special. And I'm so thankful that we dug ourselves in and really did the very best job we could. As a TV producer, I'm very, very tuned into doing my little half-hour episodes of Europe. I've done, you know, slice Europe into 130 half-hour episodes, and I've pretty much covered it from north to south and east and west. But I've done 10 or 15 one-hour specials, and these are generally special topics where I'm sort of passionate about and that I think are really important, and that I think that smart Americans could be steep on the learning curve, and it'd be a nice hour spent to learn about fascism, to learn about the Reformation, to learn about the economic roots of hunger in a world with such affluence, to learn about the Holy Land, to learn about Iran, to learn about a lot of different things that we've done specials on over the years. This is the one special that I wrote that has had legs, and it's been a hit, astounding people in public television for the last 6 or 7 years. People keep running it because it's ever more poignant and relative. We wrote the show in 2016, we filmed it in 2017, and I believe it aired the first time in 2018, and it's still running all over public television. I filmed it in 2017, the same year I was filming my 1-hour show on cruising the Mediterranean. I think I was the only person out of the 3,000 tourists on that cruise ship that had a big copy of Mein Kampf with me. It was the oddest thing to have Mein Kampf in my room. It's a weird book to be traveling around Europe with in 2017. I like to think of, like in my company right now, we're more overtly political than we normally would be in a presidential election year, but I really think it's not partisan. I don't think this is Democrat versus Republican. I think most Democrats wish we had a principled Republican Party where we could debate the pros and cons of conservatism and liberalism in a intellectually consistent way. What we're dealing with now is something more fundamental than that, and I think it is a question of democracy or autocracy. That's what's on the ballot in 2024, and that's why I think we can all get into that. Another thing is people use this word fascist. One of my pet peeves is if I hear somebody calling somebody else a communist fascist. It's just like, what on earth is a commie fascist? Well, it's the best two insults I can put together, you know? You got people misusing the term fascist, and you got smart people using the term fascist. There's a smart man, General Mark Milley. He is the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was running our military under President Trump. He knows what fascism is, and he recently, and these military guys don't jump at an opportunity to get involved in the political quagmire, but General Milley said, Donald Trump is a fascist. That's just, I can't think of a more solid, convincing, emphatic way to use that word in the proper sense. Now, when I was doing this show, I had this big idea to make a bingo board, you know, and I was going to list, I think there's 24 squares on a bingo board or something like that. I was have 24 ways that what went on in Germany in the 1920s mirrors what's going on in Turkey, in Hungary, in the United States, in different countries that are dealing with extreme right-wing populism today. And it's a little bit too clunky, so it didn't quite work. But we're going to see today in the next 52 minutes parallels. They say history repeats, and then they say, no, it rhymes. Okay, well, whatever the case, history has these parallels, and call it rhyming. But you'll see rallies from 100 years ago in Europe. You will see the big lie. You will see intimidation. You'll see simple answers to complex problems. You'll see fear-mongering. You'll see scapegoating. You'll see fake genius that stands in a bombastic spot and say, only I can fix it. You'll see political leaders locking up their opposition. A haunting part of this show you're going to see illustrates who the first inmates in Hitler's concentration camps were. They weren't Jews. They were his political opposition. He put them in the concentration camp as soon as he was able to, on day one, because they didn't wear the right uniform. They didn't kiss his ring. They didn't bend to his will. You can think of 6 or 8 famous Republicans right now that would be the equivalent of those people 100 years ago in Germany. And I was just there at this monument. You'll see the monument in front of the Reichstag in Berlin. And I learned something on this last visit with my Berlin guide. People generally only lived a year or two in the concentration camps at best. They were worked to death. But Hitler kept these most annoying to him inmates alive, generally in solitary confinement, until 1944, when he knew they were going to lose the war, and then they were murdered. That's what he did to his Kinzingers and Liz Cheneys and Mitt Romneys and Chuck Schumers and Stephen Colbert's. Everybody must wonder if there's this intimidation going on. It can happen. Don't think it can't happen. That's the interesting thing. I was really blessed in making this to have some very smart friends who are fellow tour guides of mine in Italy and Germany. I couldn't have done this without them. And you'll see my friends. These are just among our 150 guides that do the Rick Steves tours around Europe. And you'll see them in here. And they have more credibility because their families lived through this. And their words are so artful and so heartfelt. I hope that you appreciate that as this hour goes by. Also a comment I would, I originally planned to have my finger on the pause button like I do on my Monday night travel shows when I screen a show like this. But I got together with some friends last week to watch this and think about tonight's event. And the story here is just so dense and so tight and so demanding that I can't bear to hit the pause button. So I'm just saying a few things now, and then we'll watch it without pausing. I did cut out 3 or 4 minutes of World War II at the very end, just because we know what happened in World War II, and that doesn't really add to what we're talking about tonight. So you're seeing the whole show except for that. I would remind you that this show is available for free viewing anytime on my website or at the PBS app. One thing I think would be helpful to try to do is, as a society, we need to understand the people that disagree with us politically. It's really important, and I would imagine I live in a complete bubble to somebody who might be in a different part of our country and see everything different than me politically, and it would be constructive if we could get to know each other. You're going to see the same kind of dynamic in Germany. When you look at these people who are burning books, and when you look at these people who are celebrating Crystal Night, when all the Jewish synagogues and shops were torched, don't empathize with them, don't say there was good people on both sides, but try to understand what is their frustration about? What is their grievance? Why are they so desperate? And we've got to understand that there are very frustrated people to different degrees in political world today. The danger of comparing any political movement with Hitler is that Hitler took it to the extreme. But I think the fundamentals, regardless of how much you turn up the volume, are valid. You can compare but of course, it's not killing 6 million people. And it's not burning all the books like Hitler did. But there are these same strains of political reading through a recipe book to overthrow a democracy. That's what struck me as Hitler, Mussolini, Salazar, Franco, Viktor Orban, Donald Trump, all of these want to be dictators. It's like they're reading a recipe book. Every one of them. It's just demoralize trust in the press. Boom. Confuse people over what is the truth. Boom. Build up their fears of people that look different than you do. Boom. This is a recipe book for taking a functioning democracy and tipping it over. So try to think about Hitler's base or Mussolini's base. I want to thank Cascadia Daily News for taking all the initiative to get this together, and I'm just thrilled that we will have, after a break, after we see the show, the second half, which will be more of a discussion in 2 ways. But right now, thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoy this show about the lessons we can learn from fascism 100 years ago in Europe.
Question for both Rick and Ron. One of the things we saw in the film is that fascism thrives on having a population that can be manipulated with fear, misinformation, and disinformation. And a free and active press can be an antidote to that. How's the American press doing in informing the electorate in this election? Either one of you.
Well, we're doing great here in Bellingham because we've had the good fortune of not having to cover much of the national election because we are 99% local news. But we're very aware of it, and as we've reported in some of our pieces and editorials, the national election is definitely present here in our local elections. And we do a series of interviews with candidates for public office who are seeking our endorsement. And one of the questions we have to ask people now, which we almost apologize for when Dean asked this question, aside from the reader questions we get from you folks, which are excellent, we add some of our own, and one of them is, will you accept the results of the next election? And I'm happy to say that this year, I think everyone said yes. I think they meant it, but we may be the exception. We're not national level politics here in a lot of ways. So I wanted to say also, the free press is key to education. That's one of the reasons that we formed CDN 3 years ago, was we felt like there was a lack of coverage of just the basics of civics in the community. And so that's been part of our mission from the start, and we work very hard to fill that role. And I'm so grateful for the documentary. I know it's not termed exactly a documentary, Rick, but at your TV show, I'm so happy and thankful that you didn't leave that stuff on the cutting room floor, because you know, we are in these days sort of an ahistorical country. And people ask when they see someone come along who's an authoritarian inclined candidate, and they promise things that are very simple, and like, what's the worst that can happen? And they honestly don't know now. And so this serves a great purpose, and I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you. Well, as I said, I'm grateful that there is one place on the dial, not to make this a pledge drive, but you know, public television, you need something that can bring you information without worrying about what's the impact on my advertising. And when we were all beginning in our journalism, you know, the news was not a profit center for the media, for the networks. The news was, they lost money when they paid Walter Cronkite his paycheck. And they did it willingly because the networks gave to our democracy that hour without having to make money. Something happened since then, and now news has become entertainment because it has to be profitable. And if it's not making money, they have to amp it up, don't they? And I've talked to people that admit that in the United States, you can't have viable news without it being one side or the other. That's the only way you can have commercial news media now, except for mission-driven publications like we're talking about tonight, or public television, which by definition is boring. It's not trying to sell ads. It's giving you the straight, long story. It's a whole hour of news, and there's not sound effects that go with it, and it doesn't amp up if they're not selling enough news. So as a society, we need to be more sophisticated in our consumption of news. And what makes me sad as a travel writer is many people's worldview is shaped by fear-mongering commercial TV news. So they really think there are caravans of rapists coming into our country every day, caravans of them, you know, because that's the image that is fed to them in the news environment they choose to consume that shapes their worldview. I'm not a very afraid person of the rest of the world, not because I'm particularly courageous, but because my worldview is shaped by my personal experience overseas, not by news media. I was thinking, isn't the journalism is called the fourth estate? Part of a healthy democratic society. You got the three branches of government, and then you got journalism that helps keep an eye on it. And that's what it used to do, and it should do. And we're at a challenge now, and when Trump first started going, I was gobsmacked at how he would offend the very people that he would be relying on to get his message out. Because I take good care of the media because I want them to call me back and talk about my books, you know? I don't want to offend them intentionally. But Trump was doing that from the very start. At every rally, he would just insult these people and everybody would jeer them. That's part of that recipe. That's the same fascist recipe that Mussolini and Hitler were doing 100 years ago. Demoralize the respect for the media so the media is no longer impactful. I've worked long and hard to end the prohibition against marijuana. And I remember when we started 12, 14 years ago, Washington was the first state to legalize. We were really ahead of the game. And what opened things up was a series of editorials in the New York Times that had a more pragmatic harm reduction rather than a legislate morality approach to drug policy, you see. And it was a very high-minded, in-depth, lengthy series about a new approach to the war on drugs and mass incarceration. That had a huge impact just 12 years ago. If the New York Times did something today, nobody would care. I don't think it has any impact. Because these right-wingers that have this interest in their own ability to cut the power of the news off at the knees, they've done it successfully. And we don't have that fourth estate anymore, which for the health of our democracy, I think is heartbreaking.
Let me follow up on that quickly, Rick. Key to your your show is the common thread that ran through the fascist movements everywhere was it was an infectious movement. Other people saw it happening in other places, but propaganda made it spread. And the frustrating thing for me, and I think the failing of our national press today, I, like you, have a history degree. Little did I know how much it would come into use 40 years later. But you don't see the national press just deeming the things that are coming out of one of our parties propaganda. They don't use the word. They'll say, they put code words in stories now. They've improved. They'll say, he said without evidence that the sky is pink, right? It gets them off the hook for saying that we don't really believe this, but it's not portrayed as propaganda. And don't you think that the national media needs to just say it?
You'd think so, but for some reason they have to show both sides or something, or they have to temper it. And we were just talking about, these are little niceties and little luxuries to try to be polite or whatever, but I am haunted at the specter of waking up the morning after and finding out we've got a fascist government. I mean, I've seen countries that have done that. They didn't take their election seriously, and it was never going to happen, or he was just kidding, or it was just a joke. The next morning they woke up and they realized, oh, we did it. And the consequences are huge. Yeah.
Look, let's stick with media for a minute. We have a question from Matthew, and actually a number of other questioners have touched on this subject. As we saw in the video, autocrats, would-be autocrats are adept at using media. As we saw, Joseph Goebbels was a master using radio and film to further fascist ends. But communications technology has changed greatly since then. So how has technology, and especially the explosion of social media, changed the way that autocrats can, and would-be autocrats, can control information and spread propaganda and misinformation? Either one of you, both of you.
I look at it two ways. One, the digital era it frightens me because I think we're on the verge of a place, and I actually think about this very often in the wee hours of the morning, where it's hard for anybody to believe anything they see through our main transmission sources anymore, which is digital communications. We're at the point where it's long been the case where you can't believe everything you hear. Now you really can't even believe everything that you see. What I fear is that the channels that we use to put out legitimate news will become warped and distrusted to the point that no one will believe anything that they hear digitally. And then we're in a chaos situation, and we've seen what happens in chaos situations. I also, balancing what keeps me a little bit sane is that I also believe that it is probably, we don't know this, we're in uncharted ground here, a really effective tool for fighting authoritarianism. People can organize themselves to do that in a way that they couldn't here, and that gives me some hope. But it is key to the entire future of where not only our country, but societies around the globe go, I think.
I'm sad for my own unbiasedness because I'm in this liberal echo chamber of news media. But I guess the New York Times and the Washington Post has become liberal because things have moved far to the right where centrist hasn't moved, but it is relatively more liberal now than it used to be on that window of what you can perceive as left and right, which is a fascinating thing. Nevertheless, when I try to understand the right-wing populist Christian nationalism base, I've got to remember their whole outlook is shaped by that algorithm kind of stuff, whatever it is, just like mine is. We all know what our YouTube stream is like, you know, and you just get more of what you want, and they get more of what they want. And the great sort, to me, is a real dangerous thing. You know, I got a good friend, I go to a Lutheran church in Linwood, and he's a neighbor of mine. But he wants to go to the more liberal Lutheran church down on Capitol Hill. And so he actually drives all the way down there to be with more liberal people when he worships. And I have as a matter of principle, I want to stay in my community, which is relatively conservative, when I go to church and be part of that community. But it is quite a challenge for all of us not to buy into that great sort. Do you know what I mean? I mean, so many people are moving to Idaho because that's a better place to raise your kids. Because you don't want a transvestite hanging out in your toilet, you know? This is the big fear that's there. And it's something as bizarre as that fear is causing people to pick up and move. Wow. That gives you the power of the rut that they're in, but I'm probably in just the same kind of rut. I employ 100 people, and I bet none of them are going to vote for Trump. And it's not a precondition for working at my country, or my company. It's just kind of who I hang out with, you know? And there are other people who go to work with 100 people, and probably not one of them would ever dream of voting for somebody as wacky communist as Kamala Harris. So we have this big, big gap, and I don't know what we're going to do about it. Hitler was brilliant. I'm really into propaganda in the sense of, you know, creative marketing, and you can use propaganda for a good purpose, I suppose. But when Trump had his rallies, can you imagine about how some modern politician would just salivate looking at those crowds and how everybody was in sync together? And then Hitler went so far as to make sure everybody had a postcard, and any of their friends and loved ones who were unable to come to the rally, they got a postcard from the person that did go to the rally. Everybody had to have a radio. The radio was the new Twitter, you know, and Hitler jumped on that, and with his Goebbels and his equivalent of Steve Bannon, he was demonically expert at using that new avenue for propaganda. And from a political genius point of view, and the power of propaganda, and the importance of good journalism, it is a fascinating case study, I would say. Yeah.
You mentioned, you mentioned liberal and conservative religion, some divides that are happening there. I have a question from Steve, who says, what about religion? What about religion? Seems to play into current politics. How did Hitler reconcile religion, especially Christianity, with utterly evil ideology?
How can the average American who doesn't really know much about church think that the average Christian is one of these ranting, raving right-wingers that are demonstrating in the south of our country and don't care about the reality of what's south of the border or how immigrants are treated? Those are Christians that I think have been warped and taken away from love thy neighbor and the core tenets of the teachings of Jesus, or whatever religion you are. You know, love thy neighbor is not unique to Christianity. Yeah, that's a very good question. I think for me, as a progressive Christian, it's heartbreaking to think that the average person doesn't even know there are progressive Christians. If Joe Biden goes to church, well, they don't buy that. You know, they want Trump's friends who go to church with a big flag and buy their Bible with the Constitution in it. That's their idea of Christianity. So I don't know how you fight that. I don't know how you work on that, except that fear is such a basis for things. What are people afraid of? And love is a huge thing. Family culture is a huge thing. You know, and all of this is mixed up together. An episode I always use when I'm talking about Iran, when we were making our Iran special. A woman came up to me and said, "Are you an American?" She said, "Are you an American journalist?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I want you to go home and tell the truth. We're strong, we're united, and we just don't want our little girls to be raised like Britney Spears." And, you know, Ahmadinejad and those Holocaust deniers in Iran that got the Ayatollah in power and so on, how did they just seemed like crackpots. They almost made some of our crackpots look more reasonable. And how could they be so loony and still be to get 51% of 70 million Iranians when it came time to vote? Well, it wasn't sophisticated urbanites. Who was the base of Ayatollah Khomeini and the Ahmadinejad? It was not the big city sophisticates, it was the small town, less educated fundamentalists. Small town, less educated fundamentalists. That was that woman that was afraid her daughter was going to be kidnapped. She didn't care about the cost of oil. It was her culture. She was afraid that her child would become, if we put somebody on their throne like we did the Shah, that her precious daughter would become a boy toy, a drug addict, and a crass materialist. That's what scared her. And it occurred to me, that's the base of all that problem in Iran, even today, is that 51% of the society is the small town, less educated fundamentalists. And obviously I'm making a parallel with Trump's base, small town, less educated fundamentalists. But what I finish the sentence with very carefully is good people riddled with fear and driven by love. These are good people. They're just afraid, and they love their kids, and they don't know where it's going. I think this is hopeful. I really think it's hopeful. And if everybody got to know who they were afraid of, you wouldn't have homophobia. You wouldn't have a lot of phobias. You'd have an ability to live together, like some societies really treasure, and other societies are trashing. And I fear we're trashing that right now, and it's going to scar us, even if we come out of this election okay. We are scarred with this gap in our society. And I don't know how you mend together a society that's already living through the big sort.
The fact that Trump is, that was a great answer, by the way, seen by some people, to me it's a sign of desperation that he's seen as a messianic figure. And I was really struck when I first rewatched your show a few weeks ago, watching Mussolini, the charismatic leader, right? And Trump probably fits by our historical training, the definition of a charismatic leader, but there's Mussolini, and then there's Trump. He's no Mussolini. I'm sorry, it was like, is the bar that low for an authoritarian in America that we get? Right?
Mussolini was pretty good at being bombastic.
Yeah, right?
My Italian friends and I, all of us have our Mussolini, and all the Italians, they can do that puffed up, brutal guy. You got to remember, Hitler got elected and he finagled his way into power. Just dictator for a day, that's all I need, And Mussolini, he had his thugs. If you can think of the thuggiest people in our political landscape right now, and empower them by being the private entourage and bodyguard of the fascist that's coming into your town. And the fascists would come into Bellingham, and they would just have 30 people. They'd march into the mayor's office, and they would kick the heck out of him. Literally, he'd be on the floor, and they'd just be kicking him with their jackboots until he was almost dead. And then he would say, okay, you're the mayor. I mean, they took power like that. Hitler had his beer hall putsch and his January 6th, right? It was the same thing. And he failed, just like Trump failed. But Hitler didn't have as many lawyers. And he went to jail for years until the flapper age and the cabaret period and all the good times of the roaring 20s. And they said, he's just a crackpot, let him out. And nobody cared about his news. And then when the Depression hit, all of a sudden, those promises resonated with an angry people that wanted to have their messiah, their political messiah, that made complicated problems easy and told the big lie very convincingly. Isn't it interesting, this history?
When you watched January 6th, probably on TV like everybody else, did you have that flash of, oh my God, this is our Reichstag moment that's happening here?
Wow. I don't know, but now when I look at
it,
I think, and now of course, when I look at that beer hall putsch, that is so parallel to January 6th. And it's not accidental, it's not accidental. And it happened, you got to demoralize the press. You got to, fix the judiciary. There's a lot of preconditions. And it's amazing that it can happen. That's what my friends were saying at the end of the show. Their families lived through it. And they see us kind of, on vacation in Germany. It can happen. And it can happen in a kind of friendly way here where those who went along with it would kind of go, life's not bad, the economy's strong, but we wouldn't have our democracy. We could live our privileged lifestyles in a way, I think, that we wouldn't get in the streets and fight. And it would still be an effective beer hall putsch.
watching the film, I think many of us find ourselves thinking, how could people fall for this? How did they fall in line? And we have a question from Harry. Is it known what percentage of German people actually bought into fascism ideology in the late 30s versus those who just kept quiet for survival?
I don't know if any statistics would be solid and worth relying on. I do know a lot of people found comfort in being oblivious. Apparently the people of Munich did not know Dachau, what was going on at Dachau. It was a prison, but they had no idea about, the final solution. And Hitler was pretty clever at having his work camps in Germany and his death camps in Poland, farther away from the German people. So he was concerned about that general awareness. But if people were honestly curious, they could have figured it out. But I don't think they were honestly curious. And certainly no media had the opportunity to give them any understanding of what was happening then. But that's a very good question. Yeah.
I think you made a really good point at the end of the show, too, about incrementalism. People who are opposed to fascism in general are opposed to fascism, but they might go, oh, the tax part of it is okay, or this part of it's okay, or that part of it's okay, and that allows it to insinuate itself. And I think at some point people are confused themselves. Are we supporting something that's wrong or authoritarian, or is the alternative worse? We tend to vote against things in this country, I think, now, more than for things. And is the opposite going to be worse? Is the other going to be worse? And that's the basis of the entire Trump campaign today, is fear-mongering about this person's a communist. Well, there's no evidence that this person's a communist, but it's the fear-based politics has taken the front stage in this country. It's had a backstage for a long time. Now it's in the front.
I wish I was more of a sociologist, because this is all, you flirt with these ideas and you think you're getting to understand it. But I've got so much envy or admiration or respect, I don't know what the right word is, for the Scandinavian societies that really are the most content, and their democracies are so strong. They've got struggles and they don't get it all right and all that kind of stuff, and they've got lots of problems that they're dealing with, but they have a fundamental appreciation for their institutions that is being demoralized in our society. And the key to being a well-functioning society is to embrace your deep state, to embrace your institutions, because institutions are the unsung heroes of a society that has a strong weave of their democracy. And what wannabe autocrats want to do is they want to unravel that weave. And if people are committed to the health and strength of their institutions, that will help the society survive these autocrats. But the autocrats can target each of these institutions, as we've seen in our society, I think. And one by one, it weakens the fabric of our democracy. And I think people think democracy is a given, because it's all we've ever known. But democracy is, I would wager it's much more fragile than we generally appreciate. And we could lose it. And then the opposite could be baked in. And I could imagine, if you look at our society right now and see how gullible and malleable and simple-minded and short-term and greedy and frightened half of our society is, they could be marching in the streets defending what they think is the right thing. And that would be professors that can no longer tell the truth and challenge their students to think out of the box. That would be journalism that gives you an alternative perspective. There are so many things that we just don't appreciate. You lose the, I don't know why I cared about it, but I really loved when there were two newspapers in Seattle, two healthy newspapers that could have different opinions. And that left, and people hardly didn't have a whimper because they had more important things to concern themselves with. But we could teach our younger generation what are the ingredients of a strong democracy. And then at least they could diagnose a problem when they see it in front of them, instead of letting these distracting culture war issues shine a light and make us look over here when this is what really matters. That's what's happening right now in our society, hugely. And, we got it all figured out here in the Northwest, but the more I realize it, the more I wish we could all just scatter around the country and shake it up a bit.
Rick, I know you were recently, you spend summers in Europe generally, and you were in Europe this summer. We've had a couple of questions, actually a number of questions from Kristen and some other people, kind of two parts, I guess. What's the status of the emerging pro-Nazi party in present-day Germany, and how is that going? What have you witnessed there? And also, which countries or countries in Europe have come farthest in combating fascism?
I should know all that stuff better than I do. It's one of my weaknesses is contemporary issues in Europe. I bought a couple of books just during COVID thinking this will be a chance for me to get up to date on that. But I was just in Dresden, which is former Eastern Germany, a couple months ago. And it was Monday, and every Monday is the day my guide told me that the right-wingers, the neo-fascists, the neo-Nazis have their demonstration. And I found myself right there, and you had all these people with the same kind of flags and the same sort of angry demeanor as a Trump rally. And then you had the police, and then you had all the Bellingham hippies right there, you see. So it was so interesting to see that, and it was the same dynamic we have in our country in a certain way. And I guess my answer to that is Europe has the same struggle we've got, because there's the same fear of immigrants, and there's the same frustration and hopelessness of the underclass, the lower class, the people that don't have much hope and think that things are rigged against them. And there is social media that lets you find a community of fear and hatred or bigotry or whatever it turns you on. You can find that, and all of a sudden you're not alone, you're part of a community. And you can, in fact, you can meet in front of the church on Mondays and find out there's 600 of you, and you can break some windows. So that's a dynamic that's troubling in Europe, just like it is here. And I really think if we think about how can we bring our society together, I think we've got to get very serious about recognizing what is the fundamental frustration of the Trump base and to deal with it generously. And however we do that, I don't know, but it seems like we're a wealthy enough country to be able to invest in that in a more serious way than just simply to beat people. All over the Western democratic, affluent countries in the world, there's that dynamic with the angry, less educated people. In Germany, it's the former eastern part of the country that's the most angry and right-wing. And you got this Christian nationalism, just like you got Jewish nationalism and Hindu nationalism and Muslim nationalism. It's all the same kind of thing. I think it's similar to Nazism, the way it capitalized on people of faith somehow in the work they were doing.
In your writing on how travel can be a political act, you've said that American international travelers can bring back valuable insights they can share with fellow Americans. What are the most important insights they can bring back?
I keep thinking that people want to be good, and they would be good if they had hope and if they had an education, so they were less liable to be manipulated by fear-mongering sources that want to take advantage of you. And I come back from my trip seeing that the value of good governance, the fragility of the environment, the importance of an educated electorate and workforce. And I think we could focus on education. I think you could make education a case that it should be paid for by our defense budget. Because we spend $1 trillion a year building weaponry. I mean, you got to have a defense. You got to have bombs and everything. I'm all over that. But you got to measure its defense. What is the return for that extra $100 billion? And what could that be done in giving college grants to people that would otherwise be angry and going nowhere? you could give them hope and reason to play by the rules. So there's some, we could think out of the box and do a little better. I forget if I even answered your question. Was there something else that I was?
I think that works. I think you got it.
Okay.
So international travel is important, but fewer than half of Americans have passports. Far smaller proportion than many wealthy countries. Is it that we're just less curious? Why is that?
I think it's almost a patriotic duty for a lot of Americans not to leave our country. You know, who are the most frightened people? They're not the people on the West Coast or the East Coast. They're people buried deep in the middle of our country with no passports. Who really believes we're being invaded by a bunch of Nicaraguans? People who have never been to Nicaragua. If you go to Nicaragua, you cannot imagine them invading us. It just doesn't make any sense at all, you know? I just think that if you're a curious person, you'll get a passport and you'll travel and you get to know the world. If you're not curious, you let somebody else shape your worldview. I work with 100 people in Edmonds. Our mission, we like to say, is to equip and inspire Americans to venture beyond Orlando. You know, I'm not against Orlando. Even though the unofficial guide to Disney World is the only guidebook that outsells my Italy guide. So that's just a matter of market. You got reality travel and you got La La Land. What's going to sell better in America? La La Land. Disneyland is La La Land. Las Vegas is La La Land. Bellagio is a casino or something in Las Vegas, or it's the most beautiful little town in Italy. You know, there's two Bellagios. Which one is yours? I really like reality travel. I think culture shock is why we travel. Culture shock is a good thing. Many people work very hard to avoid culture shock, but I think culture shock is constructive. It's the growing pains of a broadening perspective, and it just needs to be curated, which is what I like to do, you see. And I like to travel in a way that gets me out of my comfort zone. When I think about my most impactful travels, Dean mentioned my book, Travel as a Political Act. It's all stories of going places my government didn't want me to go. Cuba, Palestine, Iran, Russia, Nicaragua, you know, a lot of it's, you know, I think in the Bible it says, know thy enemy or something like that. It's really cool to know your enemy because you realize this is just a person that lives in this sort of a political system and they're one of the pawns of that little world and I'm one of the pawns of this little world. And if we get to know each other, which our governments don't want us to do, we humanize each other, and it makes it tougher for their propaganda to demonize us, and it makes it tougher for our propaganda to dehumanize them. And that's a valuable thing. So there's a lot of reasons to travel, and there's a lot of reasons to travel in a way that broadens your perspective rather than just makes you more insular. So that's, the trick is not to travel, but it's to travel in a transformational way. That's what keeps me going. I don't need to be working now, but I just love it. I've got the dream platform for any travel writer. I'm going to make TV shows. I have 150 guides, like you've met 5 or 6 of them right there. Can you imagine being in their care for 2 weeks in Germany? Wouldn't that be something? Wow. And I get to introduce people to the world, and for me, again, it's stepping beyond Orlando, and for me, Europe is the wading pool for world exploration. You go there, my favorite country is India. You know, but I think for most people, you just go to Europe first, and if you like that, then you go to Turkey, and then you go to Southeast Asia, and pretty soon you're not a frightened, malleable person anymore. You have your own worldview, and then you can implement that here as a citizen of this powerful and wonderful country of ours, and that's making travel a political act. And that is the most constructive souvenir I think you can take home. So I just love that. I've stood on a stage here working for, what is it, the bookstore in Fairhaven, Village Books. Wonderful Village Books, yeah. For 30 years, I think I've been coming up to Bellingham once a year to give this talk just at a group just like this. And over that time, first it was always Europe through the back door. That was all the budget tricks. That's the first book I wrote, and it's How to Travel. And then I started saying, well, you can buy the book and read that. You don't need me to tell you how to catch the train and how to pack light. And it was Europe 101, History and Art for the Traveler, how to be turned on by the culture, the cuisine, the wine, the history, and the architecture, and so on. And I wrote a book about that, and I was teaching all about that. And then in the last couple of decades, I found that this is kind of a Maslow's hierarchy of travel needs that I've stumbled on as a teacher. Europe Through the Back Door is the foundation, then the art and the culture. The pinnacle is traveling in that way where you aspire to get out of your comfort zone. And you aspire to come home with that most beautiful souvenir, and that is a better empathy for and understanding of the other 96% of humanity. You can be more thankful than ever that you're American, but you've gone out there and you know that the world is filled with joy, it's filled with love, it's filled with good people, and you'll stop saying, have a safe trip, and you'll start saying bon voyage again. Because the best thing we can do if we want our world to be safe is to travel and to get to know the people outside of our borders instead of sitting with the same frightened people watching the same fear-mongering news in the middle of this great country, and all you want to do is build walls. There's two kinds of people, I think, people who want to build walls and people who want to build bridges. The irony is the people who want to build walls want to be safe. And the best way to be safe is not to build walls, it's to build bridges. Amen? Bridges, baby. That's what we need is bridges. And that's kind of what we're getting into with this whole election season of ours, as far as I'm concerned.
That makes me want to like drive to Everson or something right now. Also, Rick, I think that you're taking this Orlando thing really personally, it sounds like. And it's short-lived because it's going to go under eventually. You know. Yeah.
Well, we're approaching the witching hour here, but I do have just a couple of other questions I'd like to ask. One, how confident are you, with 0 being not at all and 10 totally, that voters will recognize the threat to democracy in this election?
No answer.
I say 50.
Okay.
Really, I mean, it could go either way.
It could go either way, yeah.
I'm hopeful that people will see the threat to democracy, but I'm not confident.
But how much do you think the electorate would be different if you have to have had a passport before you could vote?
Is that a live passport or expired passport?
Oh, well, if you've traveled first. I think the best thing the world could do if it wanted to make a smart investment would establish a fund to give every American a 3-month gap year vacation to somewhere other than Cancun or Bermuda. I mean, some real travel. And that person, it could be their one time, and they can go back to their whatever world they have, but they would forever be a more savvy voter, I think. Because right now, there's no sense that there's real people south of the border. There really, if you haven't traveled there. It's so hard to know what is the reality on this planet. You know, and we've got serious problems, but 90% of humanity wish they had our problems. And we just have to remember that. And oddly enough, I just feel like the most sophisticated voter in the privacy of the voting booth votes not for what is in their best short-term interest, in their loved one's short-term interest, but the enlightened voter will vote what is best for society here and south of the border, not in the short term, but in the long term. Because what matters is the long term. That's our kids, that's their kids. And we're screwing the future for the quarterly profit mania that we have. And there's nobody standing up eloquently and talking about that. You just get shouted down when you talk about sustainability and long term. And it's really gonna be a tough hole to dig ourselves out of if I mean, climate change is just one small example of that. Anybody with half a brain can see that when you take the trajectory we're on, you don't wanna be there in 3 generations. 3 generations goes by pretty darn quick. And all people are gonna be doing is bitching about how they can't get insurance for their house that keeps blowing down, you know? Well, that's not the solution. Sorry, I get off on these rants, but it's late at night. I gotta say, this is my first day out after prostate surgery, so. And I'm glad to be here, I'll tell you that. And I'm just glad to be able to share that. I know a lot of people already know because I've made it public, but I just thought I didn't want to not mention it, but I'm just thankful for the support that I've got, and I'm thankful for the medicine that we have to avail ourselves to. And we have a lot to be thankful for in so many ways, and we have a lot to take care of. It's a matter of stewardship, our environment, our democracy, and so much more. But right now, it's our democracy that's on the line. It's so great to have us all here. And thank you so much for getting this all together.